Hi folks, Seth Leapson here. Thanks for watching my monologue. In these uncertain times, you may be thinking about personal protection. If you are, I urge you to visit my friends at Guns Etc. They'll help you find the perfect protection for yourself and your family, and they can even teach you how to use it. They've been protecting Arizonans for over 33 years, and they stand for the great principles this country was founded upon. Or you can just click on gunsetcetera.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back, January 12th, 2021. The issues of tyranny and democracy were the largest of topics in the 1960s and 1970s in the academy. Fresh with the memories of World War II Germany and the rise of the Soviet Union, liberal and conservative philosophers alike thought, spoke, and wrote about how tyranny rises, especially from a seemingly liberal or open society. Scholars from Hannah Arendt to Leo Strauss, from Reinhold Niebuhr to others, this is what consumed them. Of course, on the right, outside the academy, but in the more general or political press, you had movies on these issues as much as you had writings from the likes of Viktor Frankl and Whittaker Chambers. There's a well-known moment in the Dustin Hoffman movie, Marathon Man, from 1976, where as a graduate student, his professor asks what his dissertation will be on, and he responds blithely, "Tyranny, sir, tyranny." In a way, it was a better time, at least a better time of scholarship and public thought, because there was, regardless of political opinion, a generalized consensus that socialism, tyrannous socialism, either of the Soviet or Nazi variety, were noxious. The enemies of liberalism, the enemies of the open society, enemies of democracy. There was also a consensus that America stood athwart it all, that while it possibly could happen here, it was not anywhere near acceptable here. And when movements, mostly fringe, or speakers, mostly fringe, claimed an American leader was a communist or communist sympathizer, they were scorned. This happened most famously, of course, with Robert Welch and the John Birch Society and Joseph McCarthy. They claimed Dwight Eisenhower or Harry Truman were communists or communist sympathizers. We thought back then that communism was so serious a threat to democracy that to compare an American to supporting it was tantamount itself to disloyalty. It was an unarticulated agreement about the horribleness, the poison, the toxins of communism. It wasn't until the 1960s, though, until you saw some comparing of American leaders, not to communists, but to Nazis. Of course, you had the student protest movement of the late 1960s, claiming American leaders fascists and Nazis, and you had a lot of that about Barry Goldwater and his movement in 1964. Famously, Gore Vidal called William Buckley a fascist on national television in 1968. The odd thing about all this was that it seemed somewhat okay to call Americans fascists and Nazis, but never okay to call Americans communists or socialists. The first was respectable. The second was deemed to be questioning of loyalty and a cheap form of politics. Indeed, when Republicans campaigned on patriotism, two things were noticeable in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Democrats would charge they were wrapping themselves in the flag, that the Republicans were wrapping themselves in the flag, and questioning by implication or otherwise the Democrats' loyalty to America. The other curious thing I never understood was why the Democrats didn't just wrap themselves up in and around patriotic themes as well. It wouldn't have been hard. So for one example, when Michael Dukakis, as governor of Massachusetts, vetoed a bill requiring the Pledge of Allegiance in Massachusetts schools, that became a huge issue for and against him when he ran for president in 1988. One might just as well have asked, who vetoes the pledge in the first place? We've traveled a long way since then, since all that. Today, the most famous American governor can say America was never really that great, and the Democratic Party can host and boast of running candidates for office, from the House of Representatives to the presidency, who proudly claim themselves to be socialists. That was a big change for the Democratic Party, which used to go into high dudgeon saying they were not socialists, tried to prove how hard they were against communism, and who resented the questioning of their patriotism. What hasn't and never seemed to change was the other side, the liberals and the left having no problem calling conservatives and Republicans fascists and Nazis, as if that was not a questioning of patriotism or their commitment, Republicans' commitment to democracy. In other words, we never really achieved Thomas Jefferson's wish of not questioning the other party's loyalty, and usually because one side didn't play by this rule, the Democrats. For example, Joe Biden can come off as a nice guy and a moderate, speaking at John McCain's funeral, saying he misses bipartisanship in a politics where you didn't question the other guy's motives. This just a few years after saying to a black audience that Mitt Romney wanted to put blacks in chains. Today, it's pretty hard to be condemned for comparing Democrats to socialists because they proudly proclaim it of and for themselves. An entire book could be written on that. What they used to chafe about and be embarrassed about, they are now proud of. But what should not be forgotten is how the other side hasn't changed. From the student protesters of the 1960s who used to call Republicans fascists, you now have major elected leaders doing that about Republicans routinely, all the while lecturing Americans that Republicans have a rhetorical problem and an insurrectionist mentality. All the while lecturing Americans that Republicans have poured rhetorical and revolutionary fuels on the embers of partisan politics and, of course, thus have inspired or are responsible for its attendant political violence. And yet we seem to have quite the selective memory here about who has said what about whom to gin up insurrectionist or revolutionary or politically violent ideation. Quote, I never thought that could happen in this country. How do you elect a person president, then all of a sudden give him the authority to be dictator? That's what Hitler did in Germany, close quote. That was James Clyburn last June. He's the majority whip in the House of Representatives, the party's number 3. In August, Mr. Clyburn said Donald Trump was more like Benito Mussolini than Hitler. It took 3 months or more, I guess, of Trump's tyranny for Mr. Clyburn to realize he had dialed or defined dictatorship down. But perhaps not so fast. It was back in March of last year where Mr. Clyburn was describing the Republican Party and said, quote, I used to wonder how did the people of Germany allow Hitler to exist? But with each passing day, I'm beginning to understand how. And that's why I'm trying to sound the alarm, close quote. When the side you don't agree with, our side, is placed outside the universe of respectable, no less tolerable political thought, you can do anything you want to them, anything. Once we're Hitler. A tyrant in power, after all, is the cause of the natural right condition to engage in justified revolution, isn't it? And when the Democrats have been using that language for so long with such impunity, whether Ilhan Omar was calling President Trump a dictator tyrannizing our communities last year, or Nancy Pelosi was calling federal troops stormtroopers last year. By the way, what was she referring to? Federal agents trying to protect a federal courthouse in Oregon that was under violent siege and firebombing, and not from Trump supporters. Then they were stormtroopers, Nazi stormtroopers. There is nothing more destructive of the rights and ends of equality and liberty, or natural rights as spelled out in our Declaration of Independence, than fascism, Nazism, or communism. And so when a political opposition shovels us into those camps, particularly fascism and Nazism, you set the conditions for revolutions, at least violence, and the right to revolution, and that can justify practically anything, including, one might imagine, adjusting or tinkering with or irregularizing elections, but it certainly would include using the mass media and our education system to anathematize and marginalize opinions and points of view and positions of those camps we now belong to, the camps of the Untermenschen, the irresponsible, the ancient regime. To put us in the words of Bill McGurn, unfit for polite society, he may be too generous. Never mind polite society, we are meant to feel now we are not any part of society. The great historian Simon Schama described the ancient regime of yore as, quote, a society so encrusted with anachronisms that only a shock of great violence could free the living organisms within. I give you the shock by giving you our media and education institutions, and yes, our political movements of most prominence, from Antifa to BLM. I give you the Democratic Party, which somehow got away with its supporters rioting and leading to the deaths of at least 30 Americans, costing upwards of $2 billion worth of damage last year, with its party leaders paying for the bail of the arrested when there were arrests. For good measure, stormtroopers and Hitler and Mussolini wasn't all we heard. Nancy Pelosi also said she was given a Sophie's choice by Republicans last year over, of all things, a budget negotiation. Plenty of other phrases would have been available to her. Back when the Tea Party was ascendant, she said she saw swastikas at Tea Party rallies. She didn't. I mean, she didn't see them. She said she did. They didn't exist. And of course, she called Donald Trump a racist on the floor of the Senate. We thank Steve Hayward for the history that following Newt Gingrich's landslide in 1994, Democratic Representative George Miller said, quote, "It's a glorious day if you're a fascist." And Representative Charlie Rangel, Democrat, on GOP budget cuts under Gingrich, quote, "Hitler wasn't even talking about doing these things." Democratic Representative Major Owens, quote, "These are people who are practicing genocide with a smile, and they're worse than Hitler." Worse than Hitler. Our own Secretary of State here in Arizona, Katie Hobbs, tweeted in 2017 that Donald Trump's supporters were neo-Nazis. All of this can come with a happy face, too. Jimmy Carter, an ex-president, called Donald Trump illegitimately elected. Then you have moderate Joe Biden saying Americans who opposed Obamacare a week after his election, this past November, were quote-unquote far-right ideologues. As not a single Republican voted for Obamacare, that's an awful big category of far-right to the president-elect, who speaks in high tones of uniting the country. Or as Hillary Clinton herself put it 2 years ago, quote, "You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about. That's why I believe if we are fortunate to win back the House and or the Senate, that's when civility can start again. But until then, the only thing that the Republicans seem to recognize and respect is strength," close quote. So you see, peace and calm, or civility, it's conditional to the Democrats and the rest of the far left, or the left, to be had only once they are in charge or in power, not before. Before is revolution time by any means necessary. And they tell us or lecture us that our politics is broken and that things have become too extreme because of us. And who is mandating and compelling loyalty tests these days? Who gets punished for not saying the exactly right thing when it comes to the modern woke language? Remember how Václav Havel wrote that storekeepers under the Soviet rule had to place the phrase "workers of the world unite" in their windows because, in Havel's words, quote, "That is the way it has to be. If he were to refuse, there would be trouble. He could be reproached for not having the proper decoration in his window. Someone might even accuse him of disloyalty. He does it because these things must be done if one is to get along in life. It is one of the thousands of details that guarantee him a tranquil life, in harmony with society," as they say. In harmony with society. One might even say peace or calm or civility. As I say, none of this is really new. It's just more voluble, and it's become more common. You didn't used to have congressmen and congresswomen talking this way. The Democrats of 1968 and 1972 wanted no truck with their radicals like the Weather Underground or Black Panthers. Today, the Democratic Party relies on them and has absorbed them. As Václav Havel put it, quote, "The profound crisis of human identity brought on by living within a lie is a crisis that can only be seen as moral," close quote. So we must recognize this time for what it is, a moral crisis brought on by a great series of lies and distortions. We know who they are. Let us make sure we are resolved to remain and know who we are. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.